Here's a true story. A couple of months ago I was shopping online for some circular filters because I was sick of using the square ones that slide into an awkward holder that never quite fits right. And then the very next day I received an email from Case asking if I'd like to try their filters in return for talking about them in a video. So I don't know what was happening in the cosmos that day, but I guess sometimes things just line up. So in this video I'll be sharing how I used the Case Revolution Magnetic 10-stop circular filter to create these beautiful long exposure seascapes. And here's a secret. It's really easy. Now my favourite thing about any 10-stop filter is that if you like long exposures, then it extends your shooting time from that small window around sunrise and sunset to basically all day long. For example, you can quite happily shoot a 20 or 30 second exposure right under the midday sun and capture images that are just otherwise impossible. Now I'll talk you through exactly how in a second, but first let's have a quick look at the filters because they're actually pretty cool. Now here's the ND1000 or 10-stop ND filter, which is virtually impossible to see through to you and me, but that darkening effect is what makes such long exposures possible with the camera. And here's how you attach it to your lens. Pretty easy, right? How good is that? So the filter itself is magnetic, and to get it to attach, all you have to do is screw this magnetic ring onto your lens ahead of time. And then from there, you're pretty much good to go. Just put a filter on like this, and then take it off like this. So my main lenses take 82mm filters and 77mm filters. So I've got the 82mm ND filter plus a step up or step down ring, whichever way you say it. And that's just the same as the regular magnetic ring, but it just lets me attach an 82mm filter to my 77mm lens. I also got this case to store my filters in. This is the circular polarizer here, which they also sent me. And the filters are also color coded on the edge, which is pretty nice. So you can see which is which before you take them out of the case. And you can actually stack them on top of each other too, which I did at one point when shooting around midday just to reduce the glare on the sea. But it had the added effect of also stopping the light down another couple of stops. So if I wanted to go even longer on the exposure, then I could, but I didn't, so I just opened up the aperture a little bit to account for the extra 2 stops. Now the only downside that I found when stacking the filters is that it's pretty difficult to separate them while they're still attached to the lens. I found it's better to just take them both off and then separate them in your hands. And if you're shooting in cold conditions and have cold fingers, then just take extra care, but I guess that applies to any other small bits of gear, not just these. Anyway, let's talk about how I made some long exposure seascapes with these filters, starting with this black and white kind of minimalist shot that I took in my hometown of Felixstowe when I visited England recently. First, here's a test shot that I took without any filter, just as I was finding the composition. And then when I flip to this next one, you'll see the effect of the polarizer, which reduces the glare on the surface of the sea and allows the colours to come through. The colours of the North Sea aren't the most attractive, but I saw this image in black and white before I took it, so I guess that's okay. And plus what I liked about the polarised version is that it had more of a matte appearance than a shiny glossy one. If we have a quick look at the shutter speed, we can see the polarised image is 1/125th of a second, and the original is 1/320th of a second, which accounts for some of the darkening effect of the polarizing filter. Now I did slightly underexpose both of these shots in camera, so I've increased the exposure slightly different amounts on each one, but that's by the by. The good stuff happens when we add the 10-stop filter to the mix, which is what allowed me to capture this 20-second exposure, which completely smoothed out the water and made this clean, minimalist version of the scene. So you can see all those little ripples that add detail and highlights all over the water have now completely disappeared, leaving behind just the clean lines of the main composition or elements. To capture a long exposure like this using a very dark ND filter like the 10-stop is pretty simple, but depending on your camera, it might be an extra step or two. So if you have a DSLR, then you're probably going to have to focus the shot with the filter off and then switch your lens to manual focus so that it stays where it is, and then attach your filter afterwards, because in my experience with my old Canon DSLR, it could never focus through such a dense filter. Now, as a relative newcomer to mirrorless, that's totally what I was expecting to have to do, and that's why this magnetic system was so attractive to me in the first place, because it literally couldn't be easier to quickly remove and then add the filter back. Now, to my absolute delight, I found that my Canon R5 mirrorless actually achieved focus through the filter, so I could skip that step myself. Your results will obviously depend on your camera. Either way, once you have your camera focused, then you can figure out your exposure. So regardless of camera, you're going to want to use manual mode for this. With a DSLR, again, you'll need to figure out your starting exposure with the filter off. Now I have a video on exactly how to dial in the perfect exposure, which I'll link in the description. But once you've done that, then you'll add your filter to the lens, and then next you need to adjust your shutter speed by 10 stops. Now, most cameras will have the shutter speed dial set by default to 3 clicks of the dial equaling 1 stop of light. So all you have to do to get 10 stops of light is dial 30 clicks on your shutter speed, and that will let 10 stops more light come into the camera. Now, some cameras are set to 2 clicks per stop, so if that's you, then go 20 clicks instead. For mirrorless users, this might even be easier again because you can just dial in the correct exposure with the filter attached and then not have to worry about that 30 clicks thing. And again, to my surprise, after doing the 30 clicks thing once, I realized my camera was actually previewing the 20-second exposure through the ND filter, so it was even easier than I expected. So as you can see, it's a pretty easy process, especially if you have a mirrorless camera. And for DSLR users, it's only a couple more steps. Step 1, autofocus your shot and then switch to manual focus. Step 2, in manual mode, dial in the correct exposure. Step 3, add your filter and dial the shutter speed by 30 clicks. Step 4, take photo. So with these magnetic filters, it really is very easy. Having used these ones from Case a few times now, would I endorse them? Well, I'll answer that by answering a different question. If I dropped one and broke it, would I buy it myself? In a word, yes. So, really for me, it's the magnetic system that's just so convenient that it makes it all worth it. And as far as I can tell, there's very little, if any, color cast from the ND1000, which can't be said for my old 10-stop Lee filter that I was using until now. But anyway, before I show you some other shots that I captured when I got back to Oz, some of which I actually used a 2-minute exposure to create an almost abstract type image, here's a quick look at the black and white conversion process, because I know some of you are going to be wanting to see it. Now, after the adjustments that you already saw in Lightroom, which weren't many, over in Photoshop, the first thing I did was the black and white conversion with the channel mixer adjustment layer. And I used my black and white plugin to generate it, but here are the specific settings if you want a closer look. So when that was done, then I lightened the foreground with a white linear gradient set to the overlay blend mode, and then I reduced the opacity, in this case to around 50%. Then I slightly darkened the sky with a black gradient in overlay blend mode and reduced its opacity again. Now I could carry on with the specific numbers, but it's all photo dependent, so the important thing is what I'm doing, and you can adjust the various amounts if you try this on your own photos. So next I just painted with a white brush along the horizon in the background to add some more dynamic light to the scene and make the distance look a bit more distant. And then I finally added some contrast to the top of this pillar thing with a curves adjustment that was then again masked just into that object. So let's have a quick look at some other images and I'll talk you through how I took them. So this one here I captured at a local ocean pool at sunrise. It was 25-second exposure at f5.6. Now compared to the non-filtered version, this one is a lot cleaner, and again all those ripples on the water fade into this smooth, almost surreal surface. And to be quite honest though, with this composition, the smooth water just takes up a bit too much of the scene, so it's not quite abstract enough to handle such a large area devoid of subject interest. So for me, this one's probably a 6 out of 10, but I'm showing it here just to make the point that making water smooth doesn't automatically make it interesting. Now, let's get to my pick of the bunch and a handful of photos that I captured just before sunset at my local beach in Cronulla. Starting out with this one that I took around 45 minutes before sunset, but thanks to the 10-stop filter I was able to take a 120-second exposure to totally blur the water and create this very minimalist seascape. So I've made some small adjustments in Lightroom, including the square crop, but here's the non-filtered view of the scene. And really it just doesn't have the same feel, does it? Alright, so let's get to my favourites. Living on the east coast, seascape photos are usually more of a sunrise thing, right? But when there's some high cloud in the sky opposite where the sun is, the sunset can actually create this beautiful pastel pink atmosphere. And when combined with the mistiness that a long exposure gives the sea, it's a perfect opportunity to create some beautiful, minimalist, almost abstract seascapes. Now I captured this next lot in much the same way as the 30-second exposure examples, but I wanted the extra smooth, misty water, so I went with 120 seconds again. And to do this, I had to use my camera in bulb mode, because unless there's something that I don't know, my camera maxes out at 30-second exposures in manual. Now the problem with this is that you can't use the 30 clicks method on the shutter speed to get to your exposure time. Instead, what you can do with your ND filter off is set your shutter speed to 1/8 of a second, and then from there dial in whichever ISO and aperture will result in a good exposure. Now you need to be flexible with ISO and aperture in this scenario if you're determined for a 120-second exposure, because that 1/8 of a second is exactly 10 stops darker than 120 seconds, so that's where you need to start. But once you've got that locked in, you can add your 10-stop filter, and then with a remote trigger your 120 second exposure. So easy, right? Now, when I started capturing these ones, I was at f13, ISO 100 and 120 seconds on the shutter. But as the sun went further down and the light faded, my shots were actually getting darker and darker, which is why in Lightroom I've had to increase the exposure slider more and more as the shots were taken later and later. Now, I know that my files can be lightened this much in Lightroom without much of a problem, but you might prefer to increase ISO or use a wider aperture to let more light in as the evening closes in. That's up to you. Now, I haven't actually gotten around to editing these images fully yet, so they still have a little bit of a way to go, but I just wanted to show you the kind of starting points that you can get to quite easily when you start taking these really long exposure seascapes, especially at dusk like this, on the opposite side to where the sun's going down. When I do edit them, I'll follow my simple 6-stage editing process, which you can learn more about when you watch this next video.